Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joan Morgan. I am the program director for the Center for Black Visual Culture. On behalf of myself and our director, Dr. Deborah Willis, who unfortunately is under the weather and couldn't be here tonight, we'd like to welcome you to CBVC. On behalf of everyone at the center, at CBVC, which is housed in the Institute of African American Affairs here at NYU, we want to thank you for being here tonight as we welcome these two very special artists, Rashaad McFadden and my dear friend, old friend, Lyle Ashton Harris, in conversation around McFadden's book, I Believe I'll Run On, an early career survey of his work. You're beginning to see examples here on the screen. This book talk and conversation is part of an initiative that's really important to us. It is a 3-year initiative called the Black Rest Project. We are asking, how do Black people take care in a climate of anti-Blackness? What does rest look like for Black people when enduring the long durée of Black suffering? What are the subtle, sustainable, and powerful ways to run on without burning out, emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually? These are just some of the questions that we will consider this evening. Our colleagues from the NYU bookstore, we'd like to thank you. They're here in the back and selling this beautiful book. Please stay on after the event, pick up a copy, and join us for a book signing by the author. I'd also like to give thanks, not just to our audience, but to everyone who helped make this event possible. To Clarissa Santiago, our program manager, Sid Fulton, who is our administrative aide, our graduate student workers, Emeka Ochiaga, who is not here but live tweeting this event, and Kira Joy Williams. The NYU bookstore director, Francisco Serrano, our photographer, Terrence Jennings, and NYU Media Services. A huge thank to our co-sponsors, the Department of Photography and Imaging here at NYU, Tisch School of the Arts, NYU's 370J project. Sorry, y'all, I am not used to having nails, and turning pages is obviously very hard for me. The Center for Media Culture and History at NYU, NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity and Strategic Innovation, and the Center of Gender and Sexuality at NYU. So I'd like to just say quickly what's coming up at CBVC. First, please follow CBVC on Twitter and Instagram at NYU CBVC. That's the hashtag for both, the handle for both. And come to our next event, which is the last of this semester, which, like this event, if you can't make it here in person, will also be live streamed. You can find out more information on our website, which is nyuiaaa.org. So it's nyuiaaa.org. We call it IAAA, but you need to know the actual letters. Sorry about that. Next month, Thursday, December 8th, we'll have a public lecture on the history of Black Miami by Nadege Green, CBVC's distinguished writer, community activist in residence for the fall 2022 semester. I'm going to just do a very brief summary of this book because I want to get to the program and our bios. By observing the interiority and quietude of Black people, despite the arduous marathon towards justice and the various trials and tribulations that simultaneously impede and inspire it, visual artist and assistant professor of photography at Rochester Institute of Technology, Joshua McFadden's photographs explore and celebrate the intimacies of Black life in the United States. McFadden's recently released book, I Believe I'll Run On, not only demonstrates his mastery of a wide range of photographic genres, social documentary, reportage, portraiture, book arts, and fine arts, and his use of the medium to confront racism and anti-Black violence. It is also a testament to the healing and protective possibilities of turning inward. He critically examines race, masculinity, Sexuality and Gender in the United States to reveal the destructive impact of these constructs on Black Americans, like Black photographers before him, such as Gordon Parks, Roy DeCarava, Carrie Mae Weems, Dawood Bey, and LaToya Ruby Frazier. McFadden documents the beauty of Black life and illuminates the specificity of Black living in our historical present, including a series of impactful photographs devoted to the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. McFadden is originally from Rochester, New York. He holds a BA in Fine Art from Elizabeth City State University and a Master of Fine Arts from Savannah College of Art and Design. His work primarily explores African American male identity, masculinity, notions of the father figure, and the photographic archive. He has won numerous awards and recognitions from Lens Culture, IPA, and Communication Arts, while he has been published in the New York Times, National Geographic, Time Magazine, Travel and Leisure, Smithsonian Magazine, Vanity Fair, and Financial Times. McFadden's newest exhibition, Joshua Rashaad McFadden, I Believe I'll Run On, is an early career survey of his work that focuses on the series Selfhood, Come to Selfhood, A Lynching's Long Shadow, After Selma, Evidence, Unrest in America, and finally, premiering at the George Easton Museum, the autobiographical series Love Without Justice. Lyle Ashton Harris, Bronx-born artist and professor of art and art education at NYU Steinhardt. He has cultivated a diverse artistic practice ranging from photography and collage to video installation and performance art, examining the impact of ethnicity, gender, and desire on the contemporary social and cultural dynamic globally through intersections of personal and the political. Harris has been widely exhibited internationally and most recently in a solo exhibition at the Institute for Contemporary Art in Miami and in recent group exhibitions at Copenhagen Contemporary, The Art of Sport, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Black American Portraits, and currently through autumn 2022 at the Voorlinden Museum in Netherlands, Art is the Antidote. A solo exhibition of his work spanning 3 decades will be presented in the U.S. by the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University and at the National Museum at Duke University in 2023 through 2024. His work is represented in the collections at MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Tate Modern in London, among many others. Harris's most recent photography monograph was published in Aperture, and he is represented in New York by LGDR. Both of these artists' work comment on societal constructs of sexuality and race, while exploring their own identities as queer Black men. In this conversation, they will unpack how one can find an internal rest in the face of these constructs. I would like to welcome to the stage Joshua McFadden and Lyle Ashton Harris. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joan, for that wonderful introduction. And as a way of, hi, here we go again.
You're right.
As a way of introducing or relating to the theme of Black Rest, I'm just going to do a short audio piece, and then we can go into introductions.
Sure.
We can begin. How does that sound?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this on?
Well, we're super excited to have Josh here joining us at NYU, and so let's everyone give him a round of applause. So I was just telling Professor Deb Willis, who Joan mentioned, Dr. Morgan mentioned that she was under the weather. So I was telling her, oh, I'll play it right now. Let me just go. We'll just start. We'll start here. Okay. There we go.
I wish you a
knowing that exhaustion is not a normal way of living. You are enough. You can rest. You must resist anything that doesn't center your divinity as a human being. You are worthy of care.
Hello.
I want this book to be a prayer, a field guide for the rest resistance, a document to be engaged with on the ground as we all navigate the reality of capitalism and white supremacy robbing us of our bodies, our leisure, and our dream space. A blessing whispered over your body and around your head, an embodied pilgrimage toward rest. Let this be a testimony to our collective survival and our present and future thriving. You don't belong on the grind. Get off the violent cycle. It is burning down because we torched it. Grind culture can't have you. Imagine a world without oppression. Take more time here. Visualize softness. Breathe deep. Envision a world centered in justice. Stay here. Welcome to your dream space. A download. A daydream. Stay here. Stay.
So I think that's a good place to start. So, yeah, welcome again. So let's first thank Dr. Deborah Willis, who is the director of the Center for Black Visual Culture, and to Dr. Joan Morgan, the program director of the center, and to Clarissa Santiago, who's a program manager. So thank you for having us. I also want to thank my students who came out. I'm actually playing hooky for my class, so they are here with me today. But yeah, it's just such an honor to be here. I just want to just also thank you, Josh, for coming and actually talking with us.
Thank you.
And I thought it'd be good just to do a little timeline, since we, Josh and I are good friends, and Joan and I have known each other from Wesleyan. So we met our freshman year, and I'll date ourselves. I think it was 83, 84. So, and the way this came about, and I think it relates to the visionary work of Tricia Hershey, who we just heard, Rest as Resistance, in that this evolved, this presentation that we're going to unfold evolved really out of rest. I mean, in fact, it was our dear friend Dream Hampton, legendary filmmaker, who was hosting a dinner this summer in the Vineyard. And unbeknownst to me, that Joan was in, we've been trying to get together for quite a while. And so we had a lovely dinner, and Josh happened to be, he came from my opening in Provincetown, and then we drove to the Vineyard, so he joined us for dinner as well. So I guess I'm sharing that all with you, not only anecdotally, but just to talk about how this came into formation. And so, but I think it's also important to talk about how we met, because we met in 2014 when I was receiving the David Driscoll Award, the 10th annual, at the High Museum. And at the time, you were a master's student at SCAD.
Yes.
And then you came to my conversation, my keynote that I was giving at SPE.
Oh, well, you fast forwarded.
Please.
You also gave a talk at the High.
Oh, I gave a talk at the High, exactly.
Yeah.
The next day. Yeah, I gave
So
the keynote the next day. You were in the audience.
Right.
And then we became fast friends, and then you came to my talk at SPE.
In Las Vegas.
In Las Vegas.
Yes.
It started out 850 people, but after showing some work, it cleared out. It cleared out to about a couple hundred. I figure I love work that can clear out, that can smoke out of space, so you can actually get to the
So by the end of the talk, it was about 10 people left.
And then after that, then we had our first conversation. Mm-hmm. February, I was looking today, February 21st, 2021, Deep in COVID, which forms the basis of your book.
Oh, yes, to the conversation.
The conversation, the book. Mm-hmm. And then I visited you in Rochester for your lecture.
Yeah.
And then we did a Juneteenth party this summer for 40 people. And here we are, November 16th, 2022.
Right, a
So
year.
A year. So,
A year later.
Yeah. So I think it'll be, I want to just, number one, again, congratulations on this extraordinary book. I should just say that on the eve of the murder, the execution of George Floyd, Josh and I were talking. He had returned to living in Rochester after living in Atlanta for getting his master's and living there for a couple of years and teaching there. And then he returned to Rochester, and we were talking, and within 11 hours, he had traveled from Rochester by car, solo. I think a friend met you, if I'm not mistaken.
Met me in Minneapolis. Yes.
Minneapolis. And that forms the basis, let's say, for this book, which is, as Dr. Morgan said, is a early career survey, but it was that impetus. And I was fascinated by that, although that the images, several which we're looking, have appeared throughout the world and from publications for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the LA Times. It was your impulse to witness, very much of your generation, to be on the front line, to go at the hearing of this lynching in Minneapolis that you went. So I think it'd be helpful just to talk about, particularly for the students, or all of us in, here today, to talk about how the whole process of why you inspired to, what led you on that journey, in terms of.
We found ourselves on lockdown because of COVID, and I guess backing up a bit, before then I was in Martinique doing a lecture at the university there, and I almost got stuck there because things started to shut down in the States. Well, all over the world, really.
So this is March 2000.
This is February.
So
okay, late Carnival was in February in Martinique. And so, by the end of it, when it was time for me to go back, really when I got back that next week, school was canceled. And then the following week, it was completely shut down. And so we were talking, we were all kind of grappling with what was going on, teaching online, trying to stay sane, I think, right? And then we hear, a few months later, we hear and see, not just hear, but see what happened to George Floyd. He was murdered by police officers in Minneapolis. I believe it was right around a holiday. What was the holiday? Memorial Day. And so I remember it happening, getting on the phone with you, and getting on the phone with one of my best friends that I grew up with. Those are the first two conversations I had about that situation. Then the next day, I believe at my grandmother's house, my father was grilling, and I was just talking to my little brothers about what happened. And so background information there, I have all brothers, and so it was always this thing in the household of...
Are you the oldest?
I'm second oldest.
Okay.
So 3 brothers, 2 younger brothers, and the conversation always was young black men growing up in America and what that meant. And so there we were again having that conversation with, about George Floyd, what might happen. And this is before the protests got really bad, I guess, or some might say good, in Minneapolis. The next day, I woke up, I meditated, we practice our chanting and meditation. I meditated, and I just got this feeling that I needed to go immediately. And so I did. I packed a bag with not nearly enough stuff because I didn't know how long I would be there, and I didn't know that I would end up there pretty much for a year and a half. And I just drove. I drove overnight. I had this kind of different energy for some reason. And I drove overnight. A friend of mine that lived in Texas at the time met me there once. You know, he called me and I was already on the road, and he said, "Oh my God, are you going alone? Okay, I'll meet you there." Glad he did, because, you know, when it was chaotic when I arrived, the very first night, you know, the fires were happening. I ended up losing my car, didn't know where it was, and so he was able to help me look for it and things like that. And so I'm very grateful that he came. So I guess that's like leading up to that moment. Mm-hmm.
So what is it in your, I mean, because I myself did not go, so I'm just wondering, what was it about? I mean, what did your parents say at that time? What did you, I mean, you were grilling, you said the day before, so did you check in with your parents? I mean, was there concern that you would be traveling alone across the country? I mean, what was that whole process? I'm just...
I actually did not check in with many people, because I think that it's easy to get talked out of something. And so I only told my grandmother. And she, what did she say? I said, "I have to go." I said, "I'm going to Minneapolis." And she said, "I know." And that's it. And I left. So my parents didn't know until I got there that I was there. A lot of people didn't know. I don't think you did either.
Yeah.
You didn't. The next day, you were like, "Oh, you went. You're there."
From the road. So what was it like in terms of what was it? I mean, in terms of at what point did you? In terms of you obviously went with camera equipment. You went to document. I mean, were you prepared in that sense? I mean, what was the experience of engaging with other photographers? I mean, how did you land? I'm just interested in terms of, like, if you think about in the history of documentary photographers, Gordon Parks said, I mean, what is that whole act of somehow deciding to go witness in a particular experience, and what does it mean to the bravery that sort of took, given that there was a lot of unrest that was happening at that time?
Well, I think I'd have to talk about the fact that, I've photographed protests before. So you'll also see, other examples in the book, in the work, of
Could you name a few?
After Selma. After Selma is a project that I made in Selma, Alabama, in 2015. And around that time, the protest...
It's anniversary, right?
Ferguson was going on.
Okay.
At that time. I did not go to Ferguson, but there was also the commemoration of the march from Selma to Montgomery, 50-year commemoration. And so I was wrestling with the idea of, well, where are we now? We see protests across the country for the same things that, the civil rights leaders marched for back in 1965. And so I was thinking about that, and so I traveled to Alabama to document those protests, but also protests in Atlanta, surrounding areas. I would photograph that. And so bringing that through from 2015 to 2020 was different for me. It was different in 2020. Because I would say in 2017, I was working on my first book, Come to Selfhood, and we did a conversation for that book. And I think we were at your studio doing that conversation, but we heard of the police killing of Philando Castile.
And that was in the city. I mean, it's curious to me because we're talking about the documentary impulse as well as protest work, but a lot of the work is highly personal, highly autobiographical, and I'm just interested in the relationship in terms of the construction of the self, but also in terms of your Come to Selfhood, for example, or the project where you have young African American men from different gender identifications, etc., with portraits of their father, and and the whole act of like writing letters, and which is very healing in terms of thinking about the relation between black men, particularly black men and their sons, or black men and their fathers. And I'm wondering to what extent is that deep personal but also healing work, which is also about reconstructing other narratives around the idea of the family, the black family, lineage, etc., how that actually influences, let's say, the protest work, because I don't think this is just someone who is going out and chasing, unrest around the country, but someone is coming to the work with a highly personal, sensitive way of thinking about identity, about how the healing of the self, the healing of the black community, the healing of relationships between black men, from both a collective sense, but also a highly personal sense. For example, here, maybe for those who have not read the book, if you could talk, what are we looking at right here? Jamel Moody, 2017, from Evidence. I mean, I think it'd be helpful for people to understand what's happening in this image right here.
Well, that was a long question.
Yeah.
I think so. If we back up a little bit, and if I can go back personally to, I guess, the conversations like I had with my brothers, cooking out, which which could seem like a celebration or rest, right? We're gathering. Cooking out at my grandmother's house, yet we're talking about police brutality. And I think that's just how we almost can't exist without having those traumatic experiences and conversations. And so with the work you see with the portraits and the handwriting, it's me trying to kind of get away from just the protest images of actually being in the streets, and to actually go and ask young people, well, what are you thinking? What do you think about what's going on? What are you bringing to the situation, and what is it bringing to you? Then also looking at ideas of family constructs, masculinity, and how does that exist within I guess the entire narrative.
Thank you. So I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about like your journey, because you were born in Rochester, and you left to go to, what did you do, your undergraduate work?
Elizabeth City State.
And where
University.
is that?
That's in North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Historically
what
black
was
college.
what was the reason for joining from, let's say, the north, let's say, south? I mean, how did that come into existence?
What was the reason?
Yeah.
Well, my family has deep connections in the South, right? So a lot of my family still lives in the South.
Okay.
My grandmother on my father's side is from Florida, Sanford. And then my grandfather on my father's side is from South Carolina, small town near Columbia. And then on my mother's side, they're from Alabama, Camden.
And how did they find their way in Rochester?
Well, so if we started on my grandfather's side and grandmother's side, they basically started to leave Florida and North Carolina one by one to work, to do other jobs other than working on a farm. Mm-hmm. And so they were looking to change their lives. And that's the same for my mother's mm-hmm. side. My grandmother and grandfather left right after they graduated. And so I believe they were 18 mm-hmm. When they moved to New York City. And so went from small town Camden, Alabama, to Harlem. And so, talk about black imagination, right? I recently went to visit Camden mm-hmm. to see what that was like. And my great aunt still lives there on my great grandmother's land. And I was able to see where they grew up, how they grew up, and I was able to speak to her. She actually just recently passed, and I made her photograph. She's in the book, but it allowed me to actually paint the picture of what it was like for my grandmother and grandfather to leave, and almost like not look back. And I can only imagine what they went through in the South at that time.
And your grandfather worked at Kodak for?
On my father's side, yeah.
On your father's side.
Yeah.
And what years was he at Kodak?
80s, 90s. I would say 90s.
Okay.
Yeah. Until he retired.
And what was your life like in Rochester? Because in a way, you're returning. I mean, now you're a assistant professor at the university there, and just had this extraordinary show at the Eastman House. What was it like to return home to Rochester and to reconnect with your family, and also to somehow come back to have this major exhibition at the Eastman House, as well as to be reconnecting with your family after? Tell us about that journey for you.
Well, that's interesting, because it's almost like I was doing the opposite of what my grandparents did. I left Rochester and I said I would never go back. At 18, I left.
Why is that, if you don't mind us asking?
I wanted to find my own way, as a young queer child who was misunderstood, right? I wanted to leave. And so I did. I left. And I went further and further south until I found myself in Atlanta, and I lived and worked there, did grad school. And so I found myself going back to Rochester. I got a residency at the Visual Studies workshop. And when I applied for it, but then when I got it, I said, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to go back home. What is that gonna be like? And it just kind of pushed me to confront things that needed to be confronted, to further my work and do a deeper dive into self, which the result is, Love Without Justice, my newest project.
Could you talk a little more about that? What that means for you? I mean,
what means for me?
Well, you say that. I mean, from my understanding, there's a return home in a way that propose certain challenges to the idea of the family, as opposed to the narrative of, as you're saying, being black and queer, that one finds freedom or identity away. The fact that you, in actuality, came back and to reimagine the family, to reimagine the idea of home, and to challenge that and to breathe elasticity into that. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that from your process, because I admire you for doing that. The fact that, of course, the traditional narrative is that we leave, but in actuality, you have not only gone back home, a prodigal son, and came back with institutional support by the university, a major exhibition there, and reimagining what that family is. So I'm just curious what that is like in your experience for the family, and and how the process of art helps to shape or to reimagine that for you.
Well, that's an interesting question, because it's still shaping and reshaping as we speak. So it's hard to answer because it's happening now.
Yeah.
Right? So it's only been 3 years, but a good 2 years of that is COVID. And so, right when I returned, well, I knew I was being drawn back. I was being called back, I think, by a higher call, and it was around the time my grandmother was ill, my mother's mother. And I would talk to my grandmother all the time. Both my grandmothers, I call them and we would chat. And my grandmother on my mother's side always wanted to travel the world. As you can see, she left Alabama, moved to New York City, big ambitions and dreams and things like that. And so she would tell me these things. And she would see that I was in school, I was able to do residencies and things overseas, Spain, Italy, France, and we would talk about that, and she would encourage me. And then when she got sick, she had cancer, I would go back to Michigan and visit her. And so when 2018 arrived, which is when I got the residency in Rochester, I said, you know what? I have to take it upon myself to change the narrative. And what does freedom look like for me? And as you can see in some of the work, you'll see that I asked some of the participants, what is freedom to you? And in a way, I was using that work to see what my peers were saying about freedom, because I didn't know myself. And so really I was learning from my peers, but also in conversations like with you or whoever else, I would kind of come to the conclusion that, oh, I need to find what freedom means for myself. And so a part of that was going back home to reimagine, as you say, the home space and what that means. And so when I did return in 2019, to begin at RIT, my grandmother passed the very next month in October. And it just kind of blew my mind, you know, that I was kind of being drawn in that way. And you see, I guess the burial photo, that's from my grandmother's funeral. And so I'm documenting during this time. I was able to speak with her as she was under my mother's care. So my mother was my grandmother's caretaker, and I went and spoke to her. And I spoke to her about photographs. And she told me stories about her as a young person in Harlem with my grandfather, and she talked about photography, and my grandfather was an apprentice in a photo studio, all of those types of things. And it helped me kind of build these other stories outside of, I guess, traumatic experiences that I had growing up.
Thank you so much. So I'm just curious, how does all of that personal work, just in terms of looking at the documentary impulse in the work, I'm thinking about the portrait of Breonna Taylor's mother, and also, or the, after the verdict of, that was in Minneapolis, I'm just thinking about, or even Breonna Taylor's, her four girlfriends. This is Josh's
my mother here.
mother.
And that's in the backyard of my grandmother's house. And this was made in Minneapolis, and that's actually my friend who came to meet me there in Minneapolis. And so I actually returned to make that photograph.
In Minneapolis?
In Minneapolis, okay. Yeah.
And that was done, what year was that done?
That was actually done in 2021. Yeah.
Could you tell us about this one, please?
This is E.W. Higginbottom, and his father was lynched by a lynch mob. And so he actually never really had a chance to really know his father because he was an infant.
Was this Professor Brian Stevenson's? Where was?
That was a part of the soil collection ceremony for the EJI. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so here's evidence, and this is the work that I'm asking. What do you think about this term, I am a man or be a man? But then also asking, what's your idea of freedom? And they have the agency to write whatever they want. And so then people are able to engage with these papers and with their writing, not only like this, but in a newspaper that I published and that I disseminate for free.
And how do you find your subjects? I mean, how do you meet people? I mean, how do you do? Are you free? These are friends or people, fellow students or former students, or how do you locate them?
Just day by day interactions. Some were classmates, so some of this work was made while I was in grad school. So some are classmates, some are friends of friends, some are friends, some are random people that I meet. all different types of ways. And this is from the project After Selma that I spoke about, commemorating the march from Montgomery, Selma to Montgomery, sorry.
Could you tell us about 50th anniversary for those who might not be familiar?
Oh, yes. So that was in 1965, the march led by Martin Luther King in Selma to Montgomery, which was a march that helped African Americans achieve voters' rights in this country. But that march, was not successful the first time because they were met by police officers and they were beat by police officers. And so that's why it was called Bloody Sunday. And now they have that commemoration every year. And so in 2015, that was the 50th commemoration.
And we just saw Breonna Taylor's mother.
Yes, that was Breonna Taylor's mother.
Girlfriends.
And so, that year was rough. And I'm still kind of dealing with that trauma.
So tell us, what is it, what do you say? For those of us who are not photographers, and what would it mean to encounter someone who's in the process of grief? I think one of the things that came up in the REST project is the fact to allowing space to properly grieve. So what was it like to witness her and to be in conversation with her and the act of photographing a bereaved mother? I'm curious. Obviously she'd been photographed, hundreds and hundreds of times, but I was wondering in terms of how do you as a photographer, and meaning Joshua, how do you engage your subjects? What, in terms of engaging a rapport, I'm just curious, that whole process.
It's different every time. So I would say situational. As always, like with respect. And I think, number one, sometimes, or a lot of times, people don't approach people with respect. And that's even if you don't have a camera. That's just in general, right?
Can you say more about that?
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Well,
respect. I think that's, it should come natural.
But I don't think it does.
But I don't think it does for many.
And I'll give an example. When I shot my first cover story for the New York Times Magazine, the prompt was the woman she conceived the two kids on crack. There were roaches. There was a whole narrative, a script about what I'm going to be looking for example. But the question is that as you're saying, just to echo what you're saying, is how you choose to frame the subject. So in a way, it's not neutral. It's all about what the photographer or the writer brings to the subject. In fact, when that portrait appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, it went straight to the top because it was an element of nobility that they were not used to. In fact, when I got the assignment initially, I mentioned the bell hooks, and I grew up in a very critical family that we were critical of certain portraits of, let's say, stereotypical portraits of black folks, etc. So I was ambivalent about should I even go to Chicago to the former Cabrini Green to photograph, but it was really, as you're saying, is what you bring as a photographer or a writer to construct the other, if you will. So what I am deeply moved by your work, there is an element of nobility in terms of, and sensitivity that for me, it's the work embodies that for me. Even the portrait of, let's say, your mother, of course, but also the portraits of her four girlfriends. Just thinking about that image of the four young women who are by the waterfront, and it's so imbued, for me, it's so imbued with an element of, let's say, sadness, but also strength. And in a way, it's also it makes you think about the vitality and the youth that had been snuffed out by seeing it evidence in the I mean, from the handbag to the slippers. I mean, just black female youth and style, and what it means to. It speaks of the absence of that. So, but I'm very interested in how you, as an artist, as a photographer, and as someone who is visualizing life, is able to bring a level of sensitivity and to imbue that in a commercial / editorial sense when often it is not there. For example, self-regard. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important to me, and I think it's also important to say that, when working for publications and with publications, there's a wrestle for control. It's all, it's control over the image, the message, the text, and the final product. And, it's a back and forth. And not every editor is, the same.
Yes, yeah.
And so, you're dealing with all of that stuff when telling stories for publications. Mm-hmm.
No, what I really love about that, man, is congratulations on a powerful book. And I was sharing with a intern of mine today, and because I think there's the element of amnesia. From my experience, even in New York, just thinking about when you were out on the road and I was upstate and just thinking about the level of protests and the social activism, BLM, all the energy, the fact that the city had reimagined itself as a place for youth, thinking about where, and now something shifted, radically. And I'm thinking about how the text, the book, functions as a document of something, a deeply pivotal time, which has definitely influenced where we are today. So, yes, I think it's deeply, this is a photograph of Brianna's, her girlfriends.
Yeah, that was.
So tell us about that experience. How did you ask them? Were they hanging out or by the water? How that came to be, how the portrait came to be.
Well, then this is Breonna Taylor's mother.
Yes.
Well, it was just so sad. It was just so sad, I think that with Breonna Taylor's story and how initially nobody even knew about what happened just made it that much worse. And so talking with her friends about how they were working to get that hashtag out there really spoke volumes, about Say Her Name, and that just sits with me, about how Breonna Taylor's story was going, ignored, and, getting lost in the sauce, basically. And they talked about their childhood experiences, They talked about going to school, just regular days, and just their disbelief. Yeah.
So with regard to the theme for the center's 3-year-long on rest and Black rest, I'm just curious how do you, the act of self-care, because this is a form of witnessing, and how does rest figure into a healing modality in terms of taking care of oneself through the process of creating work, witnessing, being on the road, being tear gassed, by the police, being called, racial epithets or homophobic epithets. What do you deal with? How do you, speaking of rest, it would be helpful for the audience or for me, for that matter, to talk about the idea of rest. What does it mean to self-care, to love oneself, at the same time continue to do it is what you do?
At the same at the same time, sometimes you say like, well, what is the answer, and what is the answer that people want to hear, and what's the true answer?
I mean, we're among family, aren't we here? So we want to we want to hear the truth.
I don't think the two they don't coexist for me, and I think that for those from 2020 to 2021 and beyond, I was not sleeping. And those experiences also didn't allow me to sleep. And I really even didn't realize it until after the Derek Chauvin trial was over, how extremely chaotic that really was. And I think, mental health took a big hit. Sleep was non-existent. So self-care was not there. It was barely there. So I don't know where that would exist within it. And I was reminded, actually, that's a note I think I wrote down somewhere in all of these tabs here. There's a song. A lot of the work, a lot of the titles are inspired by lyrics. Some of you may have seen them, some maybe not. And there's one song, a protest song, and it says that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And that's a really tough song for me, because it's like, wow, rest can't exist for people who are fighting for freedom, or what they feel freedom should be, or know it should be.
But I would argue that there are forms, from my experience of you, I think it's always good to have someone else witness outside, just in terms of like the act of cooking meals, the act of cooking for family.
Well, we talked about that the other day.
Doing barbecue, or the Juneteenth that we did, or you and I were on the phone several times encouraging, I think it's the basic stuff in terms of like taking a bath. How one could witness someone else, this idea of it getting to a tub, or eating, or self-care. And what was fascinating for me, because I've been listening to the rest ministry, I was telling Professor Deb Willis that I put that on at night sometimes before I go to bed, but with the iPhone, but I put it on airplane mode, and sometimes I'm waking up 1 o'clock in the morning and it's still playing. And they talk about even like our mothers and our grandmothers and great grandmothers that waking up and seeing my grandmother praying 3 hours in the morning. That was something. When we stayed over at my grandparents' house to go to church, we got up at 7 a.m. But my grandfather was up at 4 a.m. and he started prayers for the family on the West Coast, and then went all the way over to the East Coast, or even coming back after Sunday school, or coming back after school and seeing my grandmother in the kitchen and just seeing her there. And there was almost like the idea of cooking or making biscuits. So I think in a way that we have found those pockets, of rest or self-care, clearly through music, through dance, through the Black church. I think clearly there has been those pockets, of how one restores, restore ourselves, or through music. The idea of club, and the fact that listening to jazz, or all that, has been, without question, where would American culture be today without those vestiges of, let's say, how we have rested or have found other modalities. Think about where would American music be without that, for example. So I think, or literature for that matter, or poetry. So I think we have clearly, and I think without question, when I look at your work, and that's what I find most fascinating about this book, is that it conceptually narrates that. Thank you. Does that say time is up? It conceptually, now we're going to have a couple minutes for questions, I'm sure. It conceptually offers us as a viewer, and not only us, but for generations to come, that will document, because at one point, there may be some students in the classroom who might decide to have kids, etc., and they may ask about a Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, and the book will be able to offer evidence of the protest and someone was witnessing, not through CNN, not through Democracy Now!, but has put their own body in the site to actually offer a way of taking it in and preserving that history. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. Simultaneously, your excavation of the relationship between black people, specifically black fathers in relation to their sons, through the act of writing. So there's a tension between that the part which is about healing. I mean, it's very beautiful, and at the same time to witness through the documentary impulse that aspect as well. So I think there's a tension for me, and it's deeply rich. So I want to commend you on that, and for the extraordinary book that you have offered us. So thank you.
Thank you.
So do we have any questions? Of course, we have legendary. Oh, yes, please. No.
It's
And tell us who you are.
I am King Anthony Jones, and I'm definitely not legendary at all.
Legendary scholar. You work with Josh?
Yes, I work with McFadden on the monograph with George Eastman. I don't know if this is a question, but mostly maybe like an explication of a lot of things that you all unearth. So, and also a lot of things that me and Josh talk about with the conception of home. There's multiple conceptions of home and layers of home in McFadden's home. Is his family home in relationship to this kind of relationship to the ambivalence of home in the state of the country? But there was something that you all brought up that was really amazing that I've been actually dealing with, or recently that came into my sight, was about the thinking and being are inseparable. Because I heard it in David Scott was talking about his relationship with Stuart Hall and how he was an intellectual, and how his biography informed his intellectual life, and he could not make them inseparable. It's in the same concept with the boys as well, because the boys, with Dark Princess writes a novel because there's the only way he could conceive certain types of narrative is through fictional writing, which you go into the conversation about imagination. There was just several layers about the dog nation of the state on black people, but what flourishes underneath that is the love for justice, the love for equality, the love to fight still underneath that subordination. And I thought that was just a really there was just so much information that was brought out of the conversation between the two of you all. It was really amazing. I hope it was recorded, because it would be really, oh good, we can use it for something else.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, home. And when we think about home, we should be thinking about rest, like a place to rest. But we talk about home a lot, and African Americans actually are kind of being torn away from their true home, and we are kind of still trying to find what home actually means for us. Some people say home is where the heart is, and that can literally be anywhere. It's and do you rest when you truly find where that space is? Or are people just looking forever?
Well, that's the question. Well, the relationship which you speak of in some of your work is about, and I remember this and I think it was like the late 70s in Morrison's writing. She talks about multiple relationships of home, but at that time, of home. Toni writes about home consistently, but she, what comes out in the New York Times article around the Song of Solomon is about, she writes about wanderers who can't find it. They wander their way from home and can't find their way back to home. But in later novels, they do find their way home, or they never actually have a space of home in many definitions. And it's the same thing in your work. But what you're getting at the heart of is about self-making. How do we understand ourselves as people? How do you, the humanity of Black people that's always questioned. So how do you consistently use your photographic work to always say, we are people, we are humans, when a state does not see us as such? So those questions are always underlining the work, and where the use of photography to make, in Frederick Douglass, to always position himself as a person. Thus, he puts himself into that view of the camera. And now we need Professor Lewis to step in.
Thank you both for, I have so many thoughts on this conversation. But one of the questions I wanted to ask Josh was, I think we often think about, and we're wrestling with this as a center. I did a talk with Tricia Hersey at the Schomburg. That was the event that actually kicked off this series. And Tricia definitely looks at rest as a resistive act, an active resistance, and something that you have to actively steal and claim. And I definitely embrace that and try to embody it, although it is very difficult. It is really difficult to do. Thank you, honey. But I also am interested in maybe those moments that are much smaller acts of resistance that we're not even aware of. And when I look at the images, I'm really struck by the use of quiet in your photos. And even the affective result for the audience is that looking at them, or for the viewer, or for those who are witnessing the witnesser's work, that there are moments like this one that just go, I think rest is also about the ability to breathe a little deeper than you might have been able to breathe, even if that is not like a conscious act on your part. And art, particularly your work, is allowing us to do that. So I'm really interested in if you could talk to us a little bit about the use of quiet in your work.
Oh, good question. Yeah. It's a really big part of the work. Even these were made in a studio setting, and a lot of photographers, when they work in a studio, they'll play music. And so when we talk about quiet in the literal sense, I like the studio to be quiet so that the participants can think about things. And it sometimes gets awkward for them because they're expecting probably something else, and they're not expecting questions, and questions that are not disrespectful, but questions that are actually, caring. A lot of the participants said, wow, nobody's ever asked me what I thought about being a Black man in America. And that shocked me, right? And they were able to kind of write in that quiet moment. But also, I think my personality comes through in the photographs. I'm a quiet person. I like kind of somber, mellow photographs. That just happens, I think. What do you think?
Yes,
I have my loud moments. I do I have those, but
we hung out in Carousel. Where were we on
the ATVs.
Carissa, did you have a question for us? Carissa Lynn.
Oh, he has a question there. Hey.
I'm thinking about the sorry. Hi. Congratulations.
Hey.
I'm thinking about the process of grief, right? We're now 2.5 years into this pandemic, into this iteration of uprising, and you're engaging a lot with what it means to hold momentums of both life and also grief. And I think being someone who loves a lot of people who have left and has loved a lot of people who have survived the process of leaving, how do you contend with memory and image, and how do you contend with what happens when a person's image survives beyond them? In some ways, you're kind of tasked with holding someone in a moment, but you're also tasked with these images become massive symbols, and what you're asking for in this is rest, but there's always a tension there, right? Because if people who are in constant processes of survival and hope are also asking for rest, they're also being forced and foisted into positions where they're unwittingly becoming symbols of resistance or being disembodied from the lives that they live. And so I guess, how do you hold that tension? How do you contend with that? How do you contend with the history of their lives and the kind of future of the image when the image itself can't really rest, even if the person needs to?
Oh, good question. Yeah, the images never rest. And I'm glad you said that, because, you know, even just the method or the act of photographing captures that tension, and it'd be there forever, you know. And that's the kind of stirred upness you feel when you're looking into the images. You know, this moment, I mean, this is actually in Charleston, after the shooting happened at the church in Charleston, and that child was there, you know, standing outside the church, witnessing families crying, caution tape, people praying, singing. You see what I'm saying? And so that is captured in that photo. The quietness, but the portrait, what that little girl may have been feeling at the time. But then it also, if you look at the portraits, where I'm asking people to write and tell us about their stories, they do the questionnaires before the portrait is made. And so as I'm making the portrait, all of those things are on their mind. And so there's always that back and forth, that tension, as you say, within the photo. And that is purposeful, because I do want it to serve as evidence. That's why the project's called Evidence. You know, so some people have the newspaper I brought them for the students, and I named it Evidence because with the history of photography, you know, photos weren't always used to celebrate African Americans. You know, they were used to dehumanize and to used as tools to prove that black people were not human, and were put in archives at universities to further push that idea, right? And so we're still battling with that. Those photos still exist, just as these exist. So what do we do about that? Right, you have great artists like Carrie Mae Weems who take those artists or take those photographs and start to reuse them, remake, or represent them. But that intention from that photographer will always be there. We're dealing with those energies all the time, and we're dealing with those energies within these photographs. And so it's very important for my intentions to be set before I begin to work. And I think that's probably what you were getting at, as far as how do you prepare to go to photograph protests or whatever. You know, it has to be a very clear intention beforehand. Yeah.
We have another question back here, and then we'll go to a show of hands.
Okay, he was waiting up here for a minute too.
Thanks for this vital conversation. I really appreciate it. With video being so pervasive, speak about how making pictures, making quiet art images, how it can represent the sovereignty of quiet. What can photos do that videos cannot do?
Oh, many things. You know, I think that with video or film, you have to see the entire thing to make a judgment on what it is. I think a photo, you're left with to wrestle with, one frame essentially. And I think that one frame, if it can leave an impact, it's that much more powerful. I'm not really a person that, is down with video, down with cinema. I mean, I like it all. I mean, I have video pieces. You just didn't see them. And I think they both serve their purpose. And I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. But I think they both have their benefits.
We have time for about one more question. Yeah, okay.
I think.
There was one. Who else had a question?
Let's take these 3 questions.
And then that's it.
Yeah.
Around that, how about if
1,
we
2,
ask a
3.
question, and then you guys answer in that way in case there's any overlap. So everyone's in a question.
Okay.
Get the question.
I'll help keep the information in. I just want you to have time to sign.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And I'm being considerate of the book source time.
Okay. I make sure my students, they
Just bearing in mind, like, the idea of bearing witness. Hi, Professor McFadden. And what it means to be present in those moments. How do you ensure that you're keeping yourself, like, within a barrier of protection? Because these are very intense moments that you are capturing, and ensuring that there's a level of, like, normalcy within yourself once you're in the process of organization and just identifying what you like to put together.
You said, how do I create a barrier of protection? For, let's say...
Hold on. Where was the next question?
Okay.
barrier protection is one.
My apologies for my voice, but when I just noticed as you were speaking, there's like just such a level of softness and compassion, especially in regards to the portrait work. And I wanted to hear you talk about the choice of language between saying making a portrait versus taking a portrait, and whether that's sort of something that you fell into or something that was intentional.
Oh, okay. Wait, yep. And then Layla.
Thank you. My question, I was curious about your initial journey to Minneapolis and what you envisioned and what your intention might have been versus arriving there and then being on assignment for a publication, and versus in thinking about what you documented and what you came away with, and was that what you were envisioning? You know, so I guess my question is your personal kind of vision of witnessing, and coupling that with being on assignment.
I do. So barrier of protection, I was going to ask for all of the projects, or is it just the protest work? Interesting. I think with the protest, there was no protection. I mean, you have these things that are supposed to protect you, things that I didn't have. This is going to get into Layla's question a little bit. I was not initially on assignment when going to Minneapolis. I was just going because I felt I needed to go. And so, I didn't have what do you call those, the vest and all of that stuff. I just had my camera and one lens and my spirit. Well, I come as, well, how many, 1,000? How many?
No, just in terms of like, what does it mean to when you're in that, and it's a question.
Yes.
Who do you become at a certain point to somehow go, this is what to talk about, to occupy that space?
I think, but wait. I think that's a tough question for me because I didn't have that information. So that is not the state I was in when I was going.
The question is
to
identify that deep energy that courses through the body to go and to witness and be present.
Well, someone would have to tell me what it was. Do you see what I'm saying? So I can't. Right. So I don't.
But you did hear it in the prompt, Joshua, because that's what you said. You said you meditated, and then you were moved by an energy that you haven't even really articulated yet, that you had to go.
Right.
And I think that might be what we're referring to as part of the barrier of protection, that deep conviction, that ability to listen to a call and go. But I got to tell you, it was COVID and I was upset, but I wasn't getting in my car and going.
Well, that's what I mean. Really, if you think about it, no, but seriously, I was leaving the barrier of protection. If you think about it, I was going as the protesters were, as journalists. They were leaving their homes, right, and leaving this idea of a barrier of protection. So, whether or not I had a spiritual practice, et cetera, the meditation led me to go. And that's all I did. And that's it. So and
that's a lot.
And that's what I did. And so to be honest, that's just what I did. I can't really come up with a fuller answer than that.
I think it's a great answer. I think it's also, but I think that's the act of becoming, and also still young in terms of we name that. To really name it would mean to have to identify with fear. The fact that you did witness, and I think getting back to the question in terms of taking versus
making.
Deb Willis taught me that. In 2016, when she first saw Come to Selfhood, which is her favorite project, and I think I said I took a photo or something like that, and she said, no, you made a photo. And I said, oh, I did. That's interesting. And it goes way back. It just goes back as I dove into Frederick Douglass and portraits, the act of making portraits, and the idea of what taking portraits actually means, and people talking about how they, to decolonize the camera, going back to the idea that people use the camera from black people to take their humanity away from them. And so to decolonize that, the camera and the language, right, is to say, oh, I made this portrait of you, and there's a collaboration with making the portrait. And so that comes with me trying to find the language for what I do. And so I guess my next step is to find a language for the barrier of protection. That's a good question.
Thank you, yes.
Great.
I want to can we just give a really serious round of applause here for
Thank you.
who were able to share tonight. And to our audience, y'all were great, especially all the students, and I don't know if he forced you to be here or what the situation was. I'm joking, but this was really great to have you here and to have your energy. We're about to do a book signing in the back, so I'm going to turn you over to the wonderful people at our bookstore. And, if you want to purchase the book, this would be a great time, and you can have it signed in the back. Thank you again for coming. Thank you so much, Dr.